Hello and welcome. I'm Asuma Katauka and you are watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories. Ukraine's foreign ministry has warned Belarus against reckless provocations during the upcoming joint Zapad military drills with Russia. Meanwhile, Kyiv has also urged European partners to stay vigilant as President Volodymyr Zelensky accused Moscow of blocking a possible summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin. The Israeli military said a missile fired from Yemen on Friday likely fragmented mid-air after air raid sirens sounded across several areas with no injuries reported. Yemen's Iran-backed Houthi group claimed responsibility, saying it launched 3 operations, framing the attacks as solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza. Ghislaine Maxwell, who is serving a 20-year sentence for aiding Jeffrey Epstein's sexual abuse of minors, told Deputy Attorney General that she knew of no Epstein's client list and never saw President Donald Trump act inappropriately. Maxwell was moved to a less restrictive prison, made these remarks as President Trump faces criticism over his handling of the Epstein case. President Donald Trump has nominated close political aide Sergio Gore as U.S. ambassador to India, while FBI agents simultaneously searched the Maryland home of his former national security advisor and prominent critic, John Bolton, as part of a national security probe, marking the latest escalation in Trump's long-running feud with Bolton. Lawyers for former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro has told the Supreme Court that a draft asylum requested to Argentina found on his phone, dated last year, cannot be used as a proof of flight risk. Police have formally accused Bolsonaro and his son Eduardo of trying to interfere in his trial over an alleged 2022 coup plot, with his defense calling the case aimed at demoralizing him. South Korea has reportedly fired warning shots after several North Korean lead soldiers briefly crossed the demilitarized zone earlier this week, prompting Pyongyang to accuse Seoul of premeditated provocation and warning of uncontrollable tensions amid ongoing U.S.-South Korean military drills. Colombia's Defense Minister Pedro Sanchez has vowed to crush armed groups after twin guerrilla attacks killed 19 people on Thursday, including 13 police officers shot down in a helicopter and 6 civilians in a truck bomb in Cali that injured 60 others. According to media reports, President Gustavo Petro has blamed the violence on FARC dissidents. Kilmar Abrego, a migrant in U.S. wrongfully deported to El Salvador under President Donald Trump's immigration policies, was released from criminal custody in Tennessee and reunited with his family in Maryland, according to media reports. However, defense lawyers warned he still faces the threat of being deported to a third country. A global hunger monitor has stated that Gaza City and surrounding areas are officially suffering from famine, and it will likely spread. The Integrated Food Security Phase Classification System said 514,000 people, close to a quarter of Palestinians in Gaza, are experiencing famine, with the number due to rise to 641,000 by the end of September. It is the first time the IPC has recorded famine outside of Africa, and the global group predicted that famine conditions would spread to the central and southern areas of Deir al-Balah and Khan Yunis by the end of next month. Earlier, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said the Gaza famine was a man-made disaster, a moral indictment, and a failure of humanity itself. He even called for an immediate ceasefire, the release of all hostages still held by Hamas, and unfettered humanitarian access. Meanwhile, let's listen into what the Director of Office of Emergencies and Resilience, Rain Paulson, had to say about the prevailing situation in Gaza.
Currently, famine IPC Phase 5 exists in Gaza Governorate, And across the Gaza Strip as a whole, over 500,000 people are facing catastrophic conditions. And another just over 1 million people, some 54% of the population, are facing what's classified as emergency phase 4. By the end of September this year, September 2025, famine is projected to further expand to the governorates of Deir el-Balah and Khan Yunis. And during this period, a third of the population of the Gaza Strip, nearly 641,000 people, are expected to face catastrophic.
Meanwhile, U.S. President Donald Trump has raised concerns on the situation in Gaza. He has also called for an immediate end to the Gaza war. Let's listen in.
The situation has to end. It's extortion and it has to end. And we'll see what happens. I actually think they're safer in many ways if you went in and you really went in fast and you did it. And people can't forget October 7th, remember that.
Professor Rohan Gunaratna is joining us as an international security expert for this discussion from Singapore. Thank you, Professor Rohan Gunaratna, for joining us. Good to see you. Now, thank you. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has called Gaza's famine a man-made disaster and a failure of humanity. What do you think? What does this statement reveal about these broader geopolitical dynamics that play in Gaza and this humanitarian crisis in Gaza?
Asuma, there is a humanitarian crisis in Gaza because Hamas has taken control of the food distribution network. Hamas has not only taken control of the food supplies that were sent to Gaza by road, but also food that was airdropped by UAE, by Jordan, and by a number of other countries. So what is important for the world to understand is that there is enough food in Gaza that has been provided by the international community and also by Israel. But Hamas has created this famine by holding on to these food supplies. And that is why it is so important for the international community to understand the necessity to dismantle Hamas so that people can have access to food. If Hamas is not dismantled, the threat of terrorism and extremism will continue. And of course, the threat of famine will become very real if there is no strategic thinking, if there is no right thinking of what is happening in Gaza. This will be a persistent problem.
And what role do you think global powers still can play, like the US or maybe Europe, or can play in facilitating ceasefire?
There are three things that needs to be done. One is that there must be a very accurate assessment of what is happening, because we are seeing that due to fake news, significant amount of misinformation and disinformation, and especially online falsehoods, is sending a wrong message. Second is that the global powers must be involved in the conflict in Gaza at this point, because there is a very active terrorist group that conducted a very brutal attack in 2023 that is still dictating to the world as to what is happening in Gaza. This group must be dismantled. Third is that humanitarian assistance and supplies should be distributed in a very creative way to reach the people so that there will be no famine and there will be no starvation. For this to be done, there needs to be a system where the aid reaches the ordinary civilians and not the hands of Hamas.
Thank you very much, Professor Rohan Gunaratna, for joining us and sharing your insight all the way from Singapore. Thank you very much. Now we move on To North America, U.S. President Donald Trump has said that within 2 weeks he expects to know whether progress is possible in ending Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Speaking in the Oval Office, President Trump expressed frustration with peace efforts and suggested he may either impose massive sanctions on Moscow or step back entirely. This comes after President Trump met Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska to end the war in Ukraine, but could not reach an agreement for a ceasefire. On the other hand, the Russian president, speaking the same day, struck a more optimistic tone. He said their Alaska meeting was meaningful and frank, and voiced confidence that President Trump's leadership could help restore U.S.-Russia relations, which have sunk to post-Cold War lows. President Putin also added that Moscow and Washington were exploring joint projects in the Arctic and Alaska. Let's take a closer look at what the two leaders had said.
But we'll see what happens. I think in 2 weeks we'll know which way I'm going, because I'm going to go one way or the other, and they'll learn which way I'm going. Well, then I'm going to make a decision as to what we do, and it's going to be a very important decision, and that's whether or not it's massive sanctions or massive tariffs or both, or do we do nothing and say it's your fight?
Что касается наших отношений с Соединенными Штатами, то они находятся на крайне низком уровне после Второй мировой войны, я уже много раз об этом говорил, но вот с приходом президента Трампа, я думаю, что такой свет в конце туннеля он все-таки замаячил и следующие шаги. Но я уверен, что лидерские качества действующего президента Трампа, они являются хорошим залогом того, что отношения будут восстанавливаться, и надеюсь, что темп нашей совместной работы на этой площадке сохранится.
Meanwhile, Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko has said that Russia and Belarus would continue to oppose Ukraine, becoming a base for future attacks. Here's what he has said.
Договорятся, что там армии не должно быть и вооружений там никаких или еще что-то. Потихоньку, не мытьем, так катанием, и армия будет, и вооружаться будет она, и что, если американцы будут поставлять туда патриоты, что россияне развяжут войну против Америки? Поэтому надо быть реалистами, все не мытьем, так катанием образуется. Не так, как мы, может быть, хотим. Поэтому, да, будем настаивать с россиянами, чтобы этого не было, чтобы они не были агрессивной страной, чтобы это не было плацдармом для нападения в будущем на нас. Но обстановка может сложиться так, что...
Moreover, Estonia has announced it is ready to contribute about 150 troops to a potential peacekeeping force in Ukraine, depending on mission parameters. This comes as NATO allies and Ukraine are working on security guarantees for Ukraine. According to NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, leaders including France's Emmanuel Macron, Britain's Keir Starmer, and Germany's Friedrich Merz have all signaled support for contributing forces under a future coalition framework. Now for this discussion, we are joined by Professor Vasilin Popovsky. He's a professor and vice dean at Jindal Global Law School. Thank you, Professor, for joining us today. Good to see you. Now, we've talked about this topic again and again, but how do you analyze the difference between President Trump's tone and President Putin's tone? What does this say about maybe there's any understanding of gap between them?
Yes, I think now Donald Trump does understand that Russia doesn't want any peace. The meeting in Alaska was friendly, but after that, everything after the meeting in Alaska very clearly shows that Putin has absolutely no intention to stop the war. He continues to demand territories that his army cannot conquer, and Trump realizes that. And yes, it took a bit long time for Trump to realize what everybody else in the world did realize long time ago. 3.5 years ago, everybody in the world realized what Russia is doing. Donald Trump took 7 months to finally get to that point. And the hope is that, as he said, there will be massive sanctions on Russia, but also he mentioned that Ukraine cannot just defend itself. It needs also weapons to strike back. And he compared that with a football team, that you cannot only defend, you need also to attack. And if United States provide Ukraine with the necessary weapons, you mentioned the Estonian president also mentioning troops on the ground. So basically, within the next week, we expect to see that United States firmly standing with Ukraine, imposing sanctions, but also providing Ukraine with the necessary intelligence, equipment, and military support in addition to political support. And that will make Putin realize that whatever he is talking about the light in the end of the tunnel, well, when he goes to prison, there will be a little light in the end of his prison cell, hopefully one day in the future. And that's the way ahead here. There is no other way. The silence and the inaction by the President Donald Trump in the last era is very clear that it only emboldens and encourages Putin to continue to fight. In fact, he doesn't fight. He strikes civilian objects and killing civilians in the cities. Ukraine is defending its territory, and it deserves full support.
And Professor, President Putin remains optimistic from what we saw about the possibility of improving U.S.-Russia relations and voiced confidence in President Trump's leadership. So how credible do you think you find Putin's optimism, especially in light of this conflict?
Yes, I heard that in Russian. Effectively, he said the relationship between the Soviet Union and United States was very poor after the Second World War. It's kind of he took like historical Cold War starting point and said it is still there, that the relationship has not been good so far, but he flatters Trump, saying Donald Trump has the leadership skills to make this relationship being restored, but we see nothing after Alaska happened. Alaska was what now, 8 days ago, and there is no any agreement. Russia and United States continue basically to blame each other. Even in Alaska, if you look at the Russian media, they almost ridicule Trump. They are looking at Trump as someone who is incompetent, somebody who is irrelevant, which to a certain extent is correct. It's correct that Trump is incompetent, but the way Putin wants to present himself as a global leader doesn't make any sense. Nobody in the world, apart from North Korea, China, Iran, and Belarus, are supporting Putin,
Yes.
whereas the rest of the world is obviously on the side of Ukraine.
Yes, Professor, since you've also mentioned it, I would like to press on that. How do you think the involvement of other regional players like Belarus might influence this outcome of any future diplomatic efforts?
Yes, I also heard Lukashenko speaking. Another nonsense. He's, by the way, illegitimate and illegal leader. He lost the last elections. And it was even the Belarusians polls that show all of that, and he refused to leave the office. And he asked the army and police to keep him in office, and the real winner, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, went to exile. So he's illegal leader of Belarus, and he knows that, and his days are also counted. He will either go to prison himself or die. And what he was talking is absolute nonsense. He was saying that troops in Ukraine will be a threat to Belarus and Russia. Well, in the last 80 years, there was never, ever any threat to Belarus or Russia from any Western country. No single bullet ever was shot into Belarus or Russia from NATO country in the last 80 years. So what threat are they talking about? NATO is not an aggressive alliance. It is a defensive alliance. NATO is supporting Ukraine and try to defend Ukraine. There is absolutely no threat to Belarus and to Russia from any NATO member, and it's historically proven. So when they talk about their security, this is always an over-exaggeration, and it is kind of trying to put the burden on the victim rather than on the aggressor.
Thank you very much, Professor Popovsky, for joining us and sharing your insight. Thank you very much. Now we move on to North America. Abrigo Garcia, the migrant who became a symbol of the Trump administration's hardline immigration policies, was released from custody in Tennessee on Friday after being wrongfully deported to El Salvador earlier this year. Abrigo, who is 30, was deported in March despite a 2019 court ruling that he should not be sent back due to a risk of gang violence. He was flown back to the U.S. in June 2023 to face criminal charges of transporting undocumented migrants. After his release, Abrigo was greeted by family members in Maryland. However, his freedom could be short-lived. Immigration officials may still detain him again and initiate new deportation proceedings. Abrigo's lawyers have filed a lawsuit challenging the legality of his deportation and have raised concerns about him being sent to another country, possibly Uganda, without notice. Meanwhile, U.S. President Donald Trump also recently talked about his administration's immigration policies in a brief press meeting. Let's listen into what he had to say.
We have 30,000 beds in Guantanamo to detain the worst criminal illegal aliens threatening the American people. Some of them are so bad we don't even trust the countries to hold them because we don't want them coming back, so we're going to send them out to Guantanamo.
As in the case of Abrigo Garcia, the government is continuing its efforts to deport him, with Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem calling him a criminal and vowing to fight for his removal. Now for this discussion, we're joined by Professor Jim Rice. He's a professor of international law, joins us live from Wigan. Thank you, Professor Jim, for joining us today. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you very much. Now, what more can you tell us about this situation with Abrigo Garcia's wrongful deportation and Kristi Noem still going behind him?
Well, earlier this year I wrote an article about this, and as you excellently pointed out in your introduction, I'm just going to call him Kilmar. Okay, Kilmar was sent. Deported is actually the wrong word. He was sent to El Salvador, to this horrible CCOT detention center, Gulag. And then it came out that he was wrongfully deported or wrongfully sent there. And so then a judge ordered that he be released and returned to the United States, whereupon he was detained in Tennessee up until very recently. Now he's finally reunited with his family. And even now, the Trump administration, in the form of Pam Bondi and Kristi Noem, are without evidence, mind you, claiming that he's guilty and he's one of the worst in the worst. And while I don't claim to, proclaim or comment on Kilmar's guilt or innocence, in the United States, under the rule of law, under the Constitution, we have a principle of innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And the words by Kristi Noem and Pam Bondi, and for that matter, Donald Trump, are not sufficient to prove to anybody that Kilmar is guilty of anything. So up at this point, it seems to me to be very clear that this is malicious prosecution, and that this individual has caused the government, in the form of Trump, to lose face. And so now they're determined to have him either re-detained or somehow sent to some third country, which would be illegal, and it would be in violation of the judge's order.
Yes, and Professor, how does this case illustrate the current administration's disregard for due process and also human rights? And you also mentioned that innocent until proven guilty.
This is the cornerstone of the American legal system. The idea of due process, and it doesn't really start with, as I used to teach my students, it didn't start with the founding of America or the American Constitution. This goes all the way back to the Magna Carta in England and the idea of the common law. And so what the Trump administration is doing is he's assaulting all of these bedrock principles that are, as I said, the foundation of American constitutional order and what we call the rule of law. So again, it's disturbing, it's frightening, but fortunately the judges have been standing up and have been making their rulings according to law and not according to the orders of Donald Trump.
For joining us and sharing that insight, Professor Jim Rice. Please stay with us as we come back to you, and we stay in North America now. Canada will lift many retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods while keeping tariffs on autos, steel, and aluminum for now. Prime Minister Mark Carney announced the move aligning with the U.S. on United States-Mexico-Canada agreement-covered goods. This restored free trade for most items, boosting the Canadian dollar. Carney has emphasized Canada's commitment to the USMCA and took a softer tone on trade following months of tense talks with the U.S. despite the progress. The two sides remain far from a comprehensive deal. Carney's approach could face political challenges as the conservative opposition criticizes his moderation. U.S. President Trump praised the tariff decision and plans another call with President Carney. President Trump has also been negotiating unusual corporate interventions like a U.S. stake in Intel, which some critics see as creating new risks for businesses. Let's listen into what the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and U.S. President Donald Trump has said.
In this context, and consistent with Canada's commitment to CUSMA, I'm announcing today that the Canadian government will now match the United States by removing all of Canada's tariffs on U.S. goods specifically covered under CUSMA. The situation we're in now is that Canada and the United States have reestablished free trade for the vast majority of our goods. Canada will retain our tariffs on steel, aluminum, and autos as we work intensively with the United States to resolve the issues there. Indeed, our focus is squarely on these strategic sectors and the future. Canada currently has the best trade deal with the United States. And while it's different from what we had before, it is still better than that of any other country.
He's removing his tariffs, yeah.
Exactly.
He's removing his retaliatory tariffs, which I thought was nice. And we're going to have another call soon. Okay. Yeah, we had a very good call.
On trade?
I like them. You know, look, I'm fighting for the United States. Canada and Mexico have taken a lot of our business over the years, over 25, 30 years, especially during the Biden years. They took a lot of our business, and it's basically all coming back into the United States now. Well, hot as a pistol, and it's coming back in. Because of tariffs and the incentives we give, it's coming back. And it's impossible, I think, for another country to stop it. And we are working on something. We want to be very good to Canada. I like Carney a lot. I think he's a good person. And we had a very good talk yesterday, so I think it'll be good.
Now for this discussion, we go back to Professor Jim Rice. Thank you, Professor, for staying with us. Now, thank you. Now, Canada has the decision to lift most retaliatory tariffs on U.S. while keeping certain tariffs intact. Seems like a step towards compromise, indeed. So, what do you think this signifies Canada's growing dependence on U.S. trade interests, or continuing to depend on U.S. interests at the expense of its own autonomy?
Well, first of all, I think that this is a step in the right direction. And my position as general has always been that tariffs should be reduced as much as possible, or, as if possible, completely eliminated. I believe that this is the best course of action, but there are exceptions. Now, the U.S.-Canada trade relationship is very old and is very important, and is huge. I don't have the numbers here, but it's in many billions of dollars per year, and it's in the benefit of both countries. It's the benefit of the farmers and the industrialists and the ordinary people, consumers of both countries, that U.S., Canada, and Mexico do business with each other. So when Trump unilaterally imposed these tariffs and tore up his own agreement that he had signed during his first administration, it was a catastrophe for all concerned. And fortunately now they're dialing these things back, but I would point out, very importantly, that this was illegal. It was in breach of the Constitution, which gives Congress the power to impose tariffs. And so again, I think your viewers know by now, I'm no fan of Trump. This is Trump once again ruling like a dictator and not like a democratically elected president.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor, for sharing that. Please stay with us as we come back to you for our next discussion as well. Now, U.S. President Donald Trump has announced a 10% stake in Intel as part of a deal with the chipmaker, marking another intervention by the White House in corporate America. The arrangement follows President Trump's earlier demand for Intel CEO Lip Butan's resignation due to his ties to Chinese firms. President Trump said the deal brought $10 billion to the United States, matching Intel's CHIPS Act funding. This is part of a broader unusual move, including government stakes in NVIDIA and rare earth mining companies. Critics warn these actions increase corporate risks. Let's listen in to what the United States President Donald Trump has said.
About the 10%?
About the 10%.
Yeah, I met a man. He was a very nice man, and I called for his removal because I saw something by a man named Tom Cotton, a senator from Arkansas. He's a great guy, friend of mine, supporter of mine, big supporter. I'm a supporter of his too. And he wrote a pretty nasty story about the head of Intel. And I said, well, if that's right, he should resign. And he came in, he saw me, we talked for a while. I liked him a lot. I thought he was very good. I thought he was somewhat a victim, but nobody's a total victim, I guess. And I said, you know what? I think the United States should be given 10% of Intel. And he said, I would consider that. I said, well, I'd like you to do that because Intel has been left behind, as you know. If somebody would have said that with Intel, would be a giant right now. Now, with that, they've had some bad management over the years, and they got lost. And I said, I think you should pay us 10% of your company. And they said, yes, that's about $10 billion. I don't get it. This comes to the United States of America. And I said, I think it would be good having the United States as your partner. He agreed. And they've agreed to do it. And I think it's a great deal for them. And I think it's a great deal. He walked in wanting to keep his job, and he ended up giving us $10 billion for the United States. So we picked up $10 billion. And we do a lot of deals like that.
Now for this discussion, we go back to Professor Jim Rice. He's a professor of international law. Thank you, Professor, for staying with us. Now, given these growing risks of corporate dependency on government intervention, like we saw this, so what could this mean for the long-term U.S.'s independence on businesses, U.S. businesses?
Yeah, that's a great point that you're making there, Asuma. Well, there's a couple of things. I find it particularly ironic that the man who declared bankruptcy 6 times over the course of his career is now talking about what a business genius that he is. Secondly, the Republican Party, where he supposedly is the head of, has traditionally been against government intervention in private business. This has been one of the key touchstones of their ideology, of their platform, that the government should not interfere in private business. And yet Trump is basically taking what could only be described as corporate socialism in terms of taking over private businesses and running private businesses, and it will not be a good thing for the United States. It's a bad idea all around. But when you listen to Trump, what you're really seeing is somebody who is not normal. This man, everything is about himself. Nothing can be about, the objective facts. Everything is about, his relationship, him, and he's not normal. I think he's definitely someone who is not well.
Yes. Thank you very much, Professor, for sharing that. Please stay with us as we come back to you for our next discussion as well. Now we move on. Ghislaine Maxwell, currently serving a 20-year prison sentence for assisting Jeffrey Epstein in sexually abusing underage girls, told a senior Justice Department official in July that she was unaware of any client list connected to Epstein. She had added that she never observed U.S. President Donald Trump behaving inappropriately, according to transcripts released on August 22nd. During her two-day interview with Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche, Maxwell said she never witnessed sexual abuse by Epstein and did not implicate any other prominent individuals. She describes Epstein as a private person who did not share details of his activities with her. The Justice Department released the transcripts and audio recordings amid widespread public interest in Epstein, who was known for his connections to cultural and political elites. The release comes as President Trump seeks to address a political controversy related to the department's decision not to disclose files from its investigation into Epstein, despite earlier pledges to make them public. Now we go back to Professor Jim Rice for this discussion. Thank you, Professor, for staying with us. Professor, what's your reaction about this news that has just come in about the fact that there's no client list, and Trump was not seen doing any inappropriate things as well?
Well, to try and answer your question, I guess I was shocked but not surprised. For your viewers, under the United States system, the Justice Department is supposed to be independent of the White House. And yet, at the same time, at the beginning of all of this, and mind you, Trump has been benefiting at ginning up this Epstein scandal for years and years, and all of his conspiracy-minded mega supporters for all of these years have been demanding to see the Epstein files. And as soon as Trump gets into office, he begins to cover this up. The funny thing is that Pam Bondi had initially said that the file was right on her desk and she was ready to release it. And then, of course, it was never released. And then the cover-up began. So then they did this kind of false red herring exercise into trying to get the grand jury testimony released, and then the judge blocked that. That wouldn't have provided any new information anyway. But the most important part of this story is that there were hundreds, if not thousands, of girls and young women who were trafficked and sexually abused. This is not a funny story. This is not funny at all. This is about the lives of individuals, the lives of girls and young women who which were ruined by this person, Jeffrey Epstein, and by his girlfriend, Ghislaine Maxwell, who, by the way, had been convicted of sex trafficking, and she was also convicted of perjury, and she was sentenced to 20 years in prison. And after the two-day meeting with Trump's personal lawyer, the deputy director of the Justice Department, she was almost immediately released to the most liberal and generous, salubrious prison in the United States Prison Service, where she is actually really not even in prison. She is allowed to go outside, as I understand it, for work release. So clearly this is a quid pro quo clearly that Maxwell understands that if she continues to participate in the cover-up of this scandal and this terrible abuse of young girls and women, that she will continue to enjoy the protection of the Trump administration.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Professor Jim Rice, for joining us and staying with us throughout our news and sharing your views. Thank you very much. Now we have a breaking news. Sergio Gore, Donald Trump's longtime aide, has been nominated as the next U.S. ambassador to India. In social media posts, President Donald Trump has said Sergio Gore, who is currently director of the White House Presidential Personnel Office, is a great friend who has been at his side for many years. President Trump has also said that he would also serve as a special envoy for South and Central Asian affairs. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has also endorsed Gore on X, saying he would be an excellent representative of America in one of the most important relationships. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, in a social media post, said Gore will make a fantastic ambassador for United States to India. This is all we have time for. We will continue to bring you more news updates from around the world.